In Rebellion Without Rehearsal, clone rights are being snatched away. But meanwhile, Teia's top talent is out scouring the streets, doing some snatching of their own. Runners be warned, and fugitives beware. Charlotte Caçador, asset retrieval specialist. Confident people make easy targets. Best not get tangled in Charlotte's web. See how they run. Adrian Sace hard at work. This psychic stalker proves cool size do look at explosions. Cloud Eater, 1,000 pounds of reptile heavyweight stirs from its sleep to give a little hug to those pesky runners. These are just 3 exciting cards from the upcoming Rebellion Without Rehearsal. I put these cards here at the front of the video for those who wanted to quickly take a look, but join me as we dive into what we think we can do with these upcoming cards. Hey, welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. As you saw there at the start of the video, we have 3 brand new exciting Jinteki cards to show off today from the upcoming set, Rebellion Without Rehearsal. Mind you, Rebellion Without Rehearsal comes out March 18th. That's less than 5 days away from when this video comes out, so we don't have much longer to wait. And I want to give a huge thank you to the kind folks at Null Signal Games who were, again, kind enough to hook us up with some exciting new cards to spoil exclusively on this channel. Thank you so much. It's greatly appreciated. Now, if you're not familiar with how these videos work, while you saw the cards at the top there, we're going to be spending some time going through each card by card, to talk about them and kind of explain a bit behind the flavor, lore, and the art, but of course also what we think these cards can do in the standard format. Give you some deck ideas, how to play against them, stuff like that. We're going to go pretty in depth, I hope. There are timestamps in the description below, so if there's a certain card you want to hear more about, please feel free to jump around. And very importantly, if you've been enjoying this content, you want to take just a moment to leave a like on the video. If you want to subscribe to the channel, share it with a friend, leave a comment. There's all really great ways to help the Metropole Grid grow. On that note, let's dive in. And our first Jinteki card, mind you, is an exciting and scary new agenda called See How They Run. It's a 4/2 agenda. It has the Psi and Security subtypes. Mind you, agenda subtypes largely don't matter. It says when you score this agenda, give the runner 1 tag. Following that, you play a Psi game. And there's some reminder text if you're not familiar with what Psi games are. Mind you, Psi games have been around in Netrunner for a long time now. So for a Psi game, the corporation and their runner, they secretly bid 0, 1, or 2 credits. So they sneak away some credits from their credit pools and they reveal their secret bids at the same time. Very notably, you have to spend credits from your credit pool, and after you reveal what you've spent, you do actually spend those credits. So firstly, it is pay to play, you need money to play, and whatever you bid, you're going to lose those credits. So there's some ramifications on economic totals. But very specifically on the outcomes of what each player bids, one of 2 things is going to happen in this agenda score. Either in the abstractly 2 out of 3 times where you bid different amounts, the corporation is going to deliver a core damage. That's scary on a Jinteki card. Now, 1 in 3 times that the runner can get into the head of the corporation, you just do a net damage. So no matter what, it's going to be damage, but that's the agenda. You're going to take a tag and then some kind of damage. The flavor text says, be patient. When the prey panics, they lead you right to their friends. And it's attributed to Adrian Sace. Now, the title of the agenda, See How They Run, comes from a kind of haunting older English nursery rhyme, 3 blind mice, see how they run. It's about mutilating rodents for some reason. Turns out the even older text, which again, nursery rhymes at this time are always kind of messed up, is about executing Protestant bishops. So good stuff for kids all around, but the idea here again is very, very literally Adrian can see where they're going to run and there's going to be ramifications here. Mind you, the character there at the front, standing on the building overlooking the explosion and either guiding or protecting or reading the minds of those escaping is, of course, Adrian Sace, the Psi clone sysop introduced in the Automata Initiative and a really, really exciting character. Now, for the unfamiliar, mind you, Psi is something that is very specifically Jinteki, and it's kind of very similar if you've read Philip K. Dick's short story Minority Report, or maybe seen the Tom Cruise film, in which Jinteki has the power to produce clones that inherently have this mixture between, I would say, science and magic, in which they can see the future, and then they can intervene and stop it. It's the sort of pre-crime idea, and we saw this on a lot of cards that, can predict the future and potentially end the run. Caprice Nase, mind you, one of the old school Psi cards, play a Psi game, end the run. Adrian's similar than that, but a bit more complicated, and we've seen a lot of other cards like that. See the future, capitalize on it. Very specifically, while not Psi itself, the original Nisei Mark II from the 2012 core set has really strong Minority Report vibes. See the future, stop the crime. Now, I thought this card was actually very notable because it's, of course, Adrian doing Psi stuff, but it is literally one of the few cards where you see somebody actually doing Psi stuff. And that's because you see physical representations in the card of the Psi powers. Now, I imagine, in the world, you don't see these, but the purple beams coming out of Adrian's head to either guide or protect or read or control, whatever, probably the clones running away from the explosion. We don't see a lot of physical depictions of psi powers in cards since ever. A lot of the times back in the FFG eras, you just saw people with glowing eyes, and the sort of magic that's happening behind the scenes was just that, magic. You didn't see it. Now, it turns out I'm not actually entirely correct about this, and the first card ever to show psi powers was actually Adrian Seiss himself. Now, I totally missed this, but there are lines coming out of Adrian's head that kind of convene to a figure in the background, and that's meant to be a depiction of Adrian seeing this person, either in a different space at a different time, somewhere far away as he's hunting down clones. And honestly, when I saw this art, and this is one of my favorite arts in the Automata Initiative, I thought that was just background art. So this art also got a lot cooler, but it turns out NSG is going out the way to actually depict psi powers, which is definitely a creative choice. It's something we haven't seen before, and it's kind of magical. Now, otherwise, in terms of the art, the character's running away from an explosion. You don't see a lot of explosions on Jinteki cards. Did they cause the explosion? Those are probably clones. And that's the idea here. Adrian and Teia are collecting and getting rid of clones. And we're probably seeing characters in a market, not too dissimilar to what you see here on Iro Ayase Pessoa's card. So pretty grim, as Luciana and Aero might, in theory, be the ones being attacked. As much as it doesn't look exactly like that on the art, it is obviously quite frightening. Now, what does this agenda do? It does two big things. It's going to do a damage. What kind of damage? Who knows? But it does do a damage. That's definitely worth something. And it's going to give the runner a tag. And let's break this down one piece by one piece. So this agenda gives the runner a tag, and that's actually something we've seen on agendas before. In fact, that can be all the text technically on an agenda. Fly on the Wall is the 3-1 NVN agenda, and while it's not very popular itself, again, a lot of the heavy lifting of this agenda is done by the fact that it exists in a faction that has a lot of inherent tag punishment at home. Now, obviously, we're in a really different spot here with See How They Run. What tag punishment do we have access to? That's a really interesting question that very specifically the Liberation Cycle wants to give you some really strong answers, even in the Jinteki card pool. But inherently, in the maybe worst case scenario, you're scoring out this agenda, hopefully you have a click left on your turn, and of course you can use the basic action card to trash a resource the runner has. Now obviously that's good. Trashing a loaded daily cast would probably be the best case scenario, but that's probably not why you're putting a 4-2 in your deck. It is expensive on top of scoring out not a great 4-2. Mind you, at that point, the runner still has to clear the tag, so it's slightly tempo negative. It's a bit annoying for them, but it's not the reason I would put this in the deck, just to trash a daily cast, spend more money doing that. And I think this does show you one big part about this agenda is that largely you want to be scoring this agenda with a click left in your turn, which means your scoring pattern, you're probably not going to do install advance, next turn, advance, advance, advance. You're either going to install double advance, score it out next turn with a click left, or do some sort of trap thing where you leave it on the table for a couple turns with advancements, and then the runner has to figure out whether they want to touch it or not. And I do think having some sort of advancement acceleration for a card like this is actually really important because, again, at the end of the day, you probably want to pair this up with some sort of tag punishment, so getting those advancements clicklessly is really important to score this out with time left. So again, things like La Costa Grid are really good in Jinteki decks and a Teia as well. That's a fantastic thing to be putting in your server. And then of course, all the other common tricks, things like Trick of Light. If you're playing more traps, you can move around advancements at speed. And of course, you can just jam out Seamless Launch and score at 4-2s a bit faster than normal. It's also worth noting that we've seen a lot of weird advancement technology, especially from the upcoming Wayland cards. And while I think some of these are harder to play than others, there's a lot of support here for getting advancements on things in weird ways that we might not expect. But that's the big thing here, is that this is technically a tag punishment card, and it's in Jinteki. And now, very notably, besides this card, right now in the Jinteki card pool in Standard, there's only 3 cards that have the word tag on it. So it's a very small pool of cards. Of course, there's some really enduring Jinteki cards that say the word tag on it. Snare has been around since the 2012 core set. And while this is not tag punishment, this is the one big Jinteki card that says tag on it. Until 6-7 months ago, when we hit the beginning of the Automata Initiative, and the folks at NSG are clearly trying to put some amount of tag punishment in Jinteki. And so we started to see stuff like this. We saw Phonotria. Well, Phonotria really hasn't popped off in the standard format. This is a really annoying card that can give tags in a Jinteki deck, and that's a hard thing to deal with potentially, but hasn't been a problem because Jinteki doesn't really have tag punishment. And that's a really big thing right now, because knowing what we know, Jinteki only has 1 tag punishment card in the entire format. So if you're not looking to spend any influence, Mindscaping, if you play it for 2 credits after you score out a 4-2 agenda, you can do 1 net damage. Now that's not amazing. That's not the most compelling reason to do this, but there are some use cases in which that can be a bit more scary than it looks. And I think while we might have expected to see more cards for Teia in the upcoming Jinteki set to support what we've seen in the previous half of the Liberation Cycle, I think largely you're going to be mostly seeing this agenda in Jinteki Personal Evolution, the original let's do some net damage Jinteki ID. And that's because this card, once you score it in personal evolution, not only is going to give a tag, not only is going to do some kind of damage, but because you scored an agenda, and whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, PE does another damage, that's going to do 2 damage. Which means if you have a click left and you play that single 1-tag mindscaping, you did 3 damage. That's not amazing. It's not the biggest reason to write home, but it's not bad. And there's some board states in which a runner with 2 cards in hand can flatline to that, as much as expecting to flatline on the corporation's turn when you only have 2 cards in hand against personal evolution. There's a lot of ways that that's going to be maybe a problem for you. So this is technically one way you can die, but there's probably a lot others that are maybe worse for you. They have to watch out for anyways in that matchup. But I still think this is okay, because again, while we don't exactly have the tag punishment in faction right now, and I do think we're going to be expecting more tag-based stuff in the upcoming set, you can import tag punishment. And this is where this gets really wild, really, really quite scary, really quickly. Spend 4 influence and kill the runner. It can be that simple. Mind you, end of the line says, as additional cost, remove a tag from the runner, so they have to be tagged, and do 4 meat damage. So again, and largely this exists in a world with personal evolution, but if you score out this see how they run, you take a tag, you do 1 net damage or core damage, it honestly doesn't matter. You do 1 net damage because you're playing personal evolution, and you follow that up with a very lethal 4 meat damage from end of the line. That does 6 damage. That'll kill most runners flat, as simple as that, as long as you can score it to see how they run with at least a click left and you have the end of line in hand. Now this card is a lot of influence, but I'd argue that if you have that strong of a payoff card that sets up board states in which the runner can just die, it's probably worth the influence. Now you can go out of your way and have some sort of pseudo consistency cards. Malapert Data Vault is only 1 less influence than running a 2nd and 3rd copy of End of Line, so this could work. But at the end of the day, the biggest tag punishment you might care about is 4 influence from Wayland, and it is very, very quite lethal. This is wild, and I think this is enough reason for people to play See How They Run and have a See How They Run archetype in PE, in which you just do install advance, and the runner really has to consider, am I dead next turn? What I think is also interesting too, right? Talking about Jinteki and tags is understanding what more tag stuff we're going to get. Because I think we're actually kind of close to having a tag-based archetype in which you're interspersing tags and damage in a Jinteki trap sort of thing. While Mitosis is a very powerful card for a horizontal trap-based archetype, which we haven't seen that much in the standard season recently, the idea now that not only can you play Urticas, but you can play Cheka Scions, and then those become problematic when you play your Mindscapings that actually do 3 net damage is kind of fascinating. Because it's hard to deal with tags and net damage. There's a lot of click compression on the runner side where they have to clear tags, but also draw their hand up, and you can attack them from multiple angles, and they might not be prepared for it. There's even some weird cards, and mind you, splashing sentries into Jinteki is always kind of weird. But while the tag and Vasilisa subroutine might be broken relatively easily, that text on the front gives you a good reason to advance your traps in remote servers and just saying which ones to check us, which ones to see how they run. I think this is also maybe a bridge too far because most of our payoff cards currently look like they're a lot of influence, but Shimon from Vladimir is really rude when you can score this out really quickly, give more tags, and then even things like Orbital Superiority is suddenly 5 damage fast advance from Personal Evolution. Maybe still a hard sell, but there's a lot of real reasons to kind of combine all these ideas together. Now, we've been talking mostly about the tag on here, and then we talked about the second part of the card and just says it does damage. And technically it does a type of damage, either core damage and net damage. Mind you, while they all both take 1 card out of hand, and that's really important when you're flatlining the runner, the core damage is a permanent decrease to hand size. And mind you, seeing the word core damage on a Jinteki card is something that can be quite exciting. In fact, a lot of the Jinteki trap archetypes will go out their way and spend a lot of effort trying to do core damage to runners. Because if the runner has less hand size, it's easier for them to flatline to some other trap nonsense that you set up, either that they run into or don't run into. So mind you, core damage in Jinteki traps is really important. But this is where I think things are really weird, because again, this might be one of the least interesting side games on a card, because at the end of the day, if you're setting this card up to do end of line, you don't care what damage is done. Unless we very specifically see in a format a prevention card that only prevents one kind of damage and not the other. And while this card sees no play, the big brute force damage protection card that you could play against Jinteki right now prevents both core and net damage. So that means that we're in situations where it largely doesn't matter what kind of damage you do. And that's really strange on a side game. There's going to be board states where I just say bid 0. I don't care, because you're going to end the line immediately on the spot. Now, in the cases that it does matter, it's probably because you put See How They Run on the table and you're either forced to score it out or you have a good window to score it out that makes like sense to you. And I think that largely hinges around the sort of like trap decks that will mitosis this out and then either flinch because they don't feel comfortable keeping the advanced card on the table and they'll just go for it. And if they get the core damage, they're happy because it makes the rest of the game really easy. Or they'll just score it out to do some sort of burst damage. And again, if they do that, it doesn't really matter what kind of damage it is. So it's strange. It's a lot of fanfare for something that might not be important if the runner dies right away, and I don't see myself scoring this thing out unless we're going to kill on the same turn, and then damage is just damage. Now, in terms of this archetype, we've seen something actually very much like this when the Automata Initiative came out, and that was this sort of Fuji acid retrieval combo deck. This 5/3, mind you, when you score it out, very specifically again in personal evolution, it does 3 net damage. And so the idea is that if you have this in a remote server, you do install advance, and then on the following turn, you can get some sort of advancement acceleration, get 2 advancements on it with the seamless advance at once, score it out with a click left. You can follow this up with Neurospike. And that again does 6 damage. And I think we might be at a point where you can put both of these cards in the same deck. You can have Neurospike, which, mind you, Neurospike into See How They Run doesn't do a non-trivial amount of damage in personal evolution. That can be kind of frightening. And then you can play your Fujis, and you have this board, you have this game in which you're trying to get your things in a remote server and protect them, get the advancements on them, and at the start of any turn when there's something heavily advanced in a remote server, the runner can just flatline. And that can be quite scary. And I think that's the easiest way to play this card that produces some very, very interesting forks. I think we talked about this when this card came out too, is that we expected to see more Fuji Neurospike decks, but currently in the standard format, they don't really exist. I think admittedly, when this card came out and people tried out that archetype, it was maybe the worst time to do it, because having an advanced card stay on the table while Hermes was the hottest card to come out, and I'm expecting to see a bit more Hermes as well now with more Mercury support, assumedly coming in the set, it's hard to keep a card advanced on the table, that's for sure. Because if you do install advance, they run central service, steal a small agenda, bounce your Fuji you're trying to kill them with, that's not good, and that rewinds everything. It's a pretty disastrous blowout. But that being said, the existence of See How They Run actually might encourage corporation decks to play fewer and fewer agendas because they actually have a stronger win condition attached to less cards. So a lot of those Jinteki trap decks will play a lot of small agendas, things like Sting, things like House of Knives. And again, that's a problem into Hermes, and then R&D can be a bit dense as much as these traps are sometimes a hard pill to swallow. But you could just be running Fujis and See How They Runs and as few other agendas as possible and just get things in remote servers and play something kind of akin to Glacier that has a kill combo threat. You might play more Anoetic Voids. You really want to keep the runner out when you go install advance. You might be playing some of the bigger ice, and mind you, Data Loop is fantastic in personal evolution, no matter how you slice it, as long as you can afford it. And then you're just setting up some kill combo with either the Neurospike or, of course, the end of the line. And I think that might be a new Jinteki archetype. Maybe just the Fuji was not enough to get the install advance kind of fork where, oh, you could die next turn to Neurospike Fuji or to this. But now there's another card that really works with that archetype, and we might see that. Now, while this seems strong, and mind you, just dying to something on the table that you can't run as soon as abstractly turn 3 or turn 4 if they set it up really well, I'm not too worried about it. Because you have to keep in mind, any deck that relies on keeping an end of the line in the hand seems to be directly challenged by a lot of the stuff we're seeing in the upcoming set. We've seen so much HQ disruption just on the couple runner cards we've been revealed in the set so far. We've seen Sebastio and Eye for an Eye says run HQ trash 2 cards that don't have a trash cost. So if you do see that sort of play being like, oh, I died a Neurospike, oh, I potentially die end the line, you just smash HQ with something like this. And it's not just Anarch, mind you. We saw Burner, a very, very powerful card that's just really good into Jinteki because you don't even interact with any of their traps, but you can diffuse these sort of operations that are going to be the kill combos. And mind you, even Sebastio, who cares about taking tags and removing tags, has a big chance of running some amount of copies of cards like No Free Lunch. So after you give the tag, mind you, with the See How They Run, Sebastio can react in the next paid ability window before you end the line and just clear the tag. Let alone, of course, we also talk about Hermes, which is going to be difficult to get things in remote server, but there's a lot of things built in inherently into the card pool, specifically the card pool that's being supported right now, that this kill combo might be a bit difficult. And if that's the case, scoring out to See How They Run on tempo to hopefully do a tag and core damage and have some sort of tag punishment, I think is kind of tricky. It's really going to depend on what we see in the set, whether Jinteki gets some single tag punishment that is fascinating enough that scoring this out with a click left is worth scheduling your entirety of your turns around. And I think there's a chance. We're seeing more and more tag cards in the upcoming set, and right now, single tag Mindscaping probably doesn't do it, but if we can get 1 or 2 more tag cards, one good Jinteki tag card that cares on a single tag, we definitely have something here. But in the meantime, play this in person evolution, kill people at the end of the line. They don't have the tech. If they can't stop it, you can do it relatively quickly. It's not too expensive. You have a real mean brew here. This is quite frightening. And speaking of frightening, that brings us to our second card, mind you, a massive card on that front. This is Cloud Eater. It is a huge snake. It costs 10. We saw one of these in the early art fans, and 6 strength gives you an absolute soup of subtypes. So firstly, it's a sentry. It's AP, that stands for anti-personnel. It's going to hurt you. It has a destroyer, so it's going to hurt your stuff. And it has observer, so it's going to watch you the whole time while it's hurting you. It has 3 subroutines. They're all very mean. Trash 1 installed runner card, give the runner 2 tags, and do 3 net damage. Very importantly, there is some text at the top that says whenever an encounter with this ice ends, if this ice was res this turn, either trashed one installed runner card unless the runner takes 2 tags or suffers 3 net damage. So basically one of the subroutines is going to be firing every time that you hit this on the turn, and it's going to res as much as there's a lot of text to make sure that works the way that it works. It's 3 influence, mind you, it is unique. So while you can have multiple in your deck, you only have 1 res at the time. That's actually really important. You could have 2 on the table. As soon as you res the second, the first resed one is going to be immediately trashed. So it's a bit expensive, but you could do it. And flavor text says, don't let it catch your scent. Art here, mind you, is absolutely fantastic. This is from Yakuza. Has been doing a lot of really, really great Netrunner stuff. You might have seen his acrylic tokens. And mind you, he also made the Netrunner World Champion trophy just last year. Now, to get into the flavor here, which is fantastic, a bit of a trigger warning, we're going to be looking at real images of snakes. I know some people don't like snakes, so if you want to pop back in which the only snake we'll look at is this snake, there's a timestamp below. But otherwise, here's some snakes, and very specifically, a really big snake. This is an anaconda. This is the Amazon anaconda, the big old snake that lives in the Amazon jungle right at home in Brazil, which is absolutely fantastic. Very specifically, I think the snake is actually quite cute, Yakuza's depiction of it. And a big thing is, I think anacondas are inherently a bit more cute, and that's because their face structure is slightly different to other snakes, because they are snakes that exist on land and also on water. So inherently their eyes and their nose has to be pushed up so that they can kind of swim and breathe at the same time. So they end up having like a snoot, kind of like a dog, which makes them really, really quite cute. And the art on this, again, is absolutely fantastic. Now, you might be familiar with anacondas because I know myself as well. Since a kid, we learned that anacondas are the biggest snake. And that's not actually technically true. While the anaconda is not the longest snake, it is in fact, though, the heaviest snake. It's a really dense, big snake. On record, the heaviest anaconda ever recorded was 227 kilograms. That's about 500 pounds. This snake weighs the same as a small motorcycle. Now, if you think that's ridiculous, it actually gets much more ridiculous in a really exciting way because this is technically really old news. And only recently, this broke a couple weeks ago, a team of scientists from the University of Queensland, they were in the Amazon filming a documentary with Will Smith, and they discovered a new snake that is even bigger. This is the northern green anaconda that lives in the Amazon, and it is just goofy big. Specifically, while the research on this is relatively new, they said anecdotal reports from the Waorani people said that of the anacondas they've seen, there's some measuring 7.5 meters in length, and weighing around 500 kilograms. That's about 1,100 pounds. That is the size of a pretty reasonably big horse. This is a big old snake. So in terms of the biggest snakes, they're only getting bigger. So 1,100 pound snake is a lot of snake. In terms of the title too, Cloud Eater is a nice one. I think when we saw this card in an early card fan, we thought it'd be just called Anaconda or something like that. We'd have a good time. But while I couldn't find anything directly attaching Cloud Eater to this, it just kind of means it's big. It's like a giant. It can eat the clouds, and there's a children's book called Cloud Eater. I don't think there's any snakes in it. Notably too, in the flavor text, it says, don't let it catch your scent. That's kind of cool too, because snakes, turns out, they have a really good sense of smell, and it comes down to something called the vemeronasal organ or the Jacobson organ, which is an olfactory smell organ that exists up in the head that makes snakes really good at smelling. It's not just snakes, mind you. The Jacobson organ exists in all snakes and lizards, but also in a bunch of mammals, including dogs, cats, cattle, pigs, and some primates. So there's a big reason why a lot of animals smell good, and it's this thing. Humans, mind you, don't have this organ. Some have a vestigial version of this organ that doesn't do anything, but there's a big reason why snakes are better smelling than us. And very notably too, when you can see snakes often flitting their tongue out, it's actually them smelling. It says here, snakes use this organ to sense prey by sticking their tongue out to gather scents and then touching their tongue to the opening of this organ when the tongue is retracted. So they're actually going out there and basically grabbing scents with their tongue and kind of smashing it into their smell organ, which is really frightening. But the snake can definitely smell you, and it's coming for you. Funny enough too, and this is largely attached to a very clumsy Google prompt, is while snakes are good at smelling, it's notable that snakes are also not always smelling good. Very specifically, the only area in the anaconda's body without scales is the cloaca, and glands in this area emit a foul-smelling musk, which is poisonous for small organisms. Scientists believe the musk may prevent ticks and leeches from attaching themselves to the cloaca. So, smells good, but also doesn't smell good. Now, the value of this fact seems a bit dubious, because saying the snake's cloaca smells bad is kind of akin to saying, scientifically, my dog's butt smells bad. You're not wrong, but also cool. Now, this thing is absolutely massive, and of course, there's a lot to say when talking about ice, but we're going to start here with that sentence at the top of the structure of the card, which is a bit overwrought. It seems a bit confusing, but let me tell you, the way that it plays out is incredibly simple. In short, when an encounter with this ice ends, As long as it's been rezzed this turn, so for the whole of this turn, you basically just gotta do a subroutine. It's worded in a really strange way, and I'm pretty sure that the folks at NSG didn't want to say resolve a subroutine of your choice, because technically the resolution of subroutines can actually be interacted with certain cards. Things like Banhar replace subroutines, so they'll resolve different. So at the end of the day, a subroutine doesn't resolve. You basically just choose to do something that is similar to the subroutines. And I think that's a nice way to kind of shortcut the mental load of trying to parse this card. Is basically after the encounter ends, do one of the subroutines to yourself. It's also structured in this really weird way in which it says like you have to make one of these choices, and if you don't choose, the corporation gets their choice, which is not a choice. It's the first one. It's not a choice. And maybe I'm missing something here really obvious, but largely you have full control over this. Well, it's true you can only choose to do the second or the third, but by not choosing, you've chosen the choice for the corporation. So choosing to not choose is your choice. So you have full choice. Just choose to choose or don't choose to choose, and that's a choice itself. So yeah, it's written weirdly, but I promise you when you play it out, it's pretty smooth, and it's just written in a strange way because the rules team had likely good reasons for that to make sense. Now that's a pretty wild text box, and we've seen a card like this, and this actually reminds me of, again, a very, very strong defining Jinteki card, which is of course Anansi, another scary creature that has text on top of its subroutines that can be really relevant, as much as the text on Cloud Eater is only relevant on, mind you, certain turns. Anansi has 3 subroutines. It has good strength. It's expensive, but when an encounter with Anansi ends, if you did not break all the subroutines, you're going to get that spider's bite, and it does 3 damage. That's a really valuable thing, because one of the downsides of having big ice is that you paid a lot for it, and then if the runner bypasses it or deals with it in any way that's not the way you'd want them to, the cool thing about Anansi is that it'll still hurt them. So if Mercury Estebrados through your Anansi, you didn't break the subroutines, you're going to get 3 net damage. Same idea with Banhar, and mind you, Banharing into Anansi happens more than you think it would, and it costs Netrunner games pretty consistently. That's the sort of idea that Anansi is so nice because it's a big ice that has upsides into cheating around big ice. And this is not exactly the same, but it has something that's actually really compelling as well, is that on the turn that this thing hits the table and it is rezzed specifically, it doesn't matter if you are breaking the subroutines or if you're not breaking the subroutines. It only matters if the encounter ends. So very similarly, if the runner thinks they're going to Estebrado through your giant snake, oops, you got to believe it's a subroutine. Next up, Banhar. Yeah, 3 net damage only, but also one of their subroutines is actually going to do its thing. And that's cute. That's nice. It's not as flexible, arguably, as Anansi because it is temporal. It's only on the turn you res it, but it's nice to have big ice that has less downsides to people cheating around it in ways that you would not like them to do as a corporation. Keep this in mind too, very notably like Anansi, this fires when an encounter ends, and this is a nice way to deal with Anansi, and I think you're going to see a bit more of this card in the near future, is Flip Switch. You can jack out, however, if you jack out during the encounter with an Anansi or now with a Cloud Eater, the bad thing will happen to you. That being said, you have a paid ability window that you can jack out during the approach after the corporation has rezzed the ice. So if you see suddenly a big snake and you have a flip switch, you can jack out and nothing bad will happen to you. Only the bad thing happens if you mash continue to movement on Jinteki.net, which a fair people do as well, because it is a corner cutting thing. But do keep in mind, there is a window on approach for you to walk away from that. So it'll be okay. That's a really neat thing about this card too, is that its text is only relevant for one turn, but is relevant for every single encounter on that turn. So it kind of highly incentivizes you to get your money's worth, and 10 is a lot of money, to kind of introduce the runner to the snake as many times as possible within the same turn. And there's a lot of really good ways to do it. Some are meaner than other. Mind you, this only works on the turn it's res, but if you can res the thing and the runner goes through it and then gets ganked back into it, it's an absolute nightmare. And while you can't imagine art aligning better with the ice you're attaching it to, it's quite gross. I think you could also kind of circularly argue that some of the weirder cards that force the runner back into ice get a bit more value with this thing. Things like Teia Nase that throws you backwards. Do you want to run the server again? Deal with the Cloud Eater. Things like Code Replicator that says Cloud Eater again. At the end of the day, these don't make a lot of sense because the runner can just jack out. So you're just giving them one more option if they wanted to. I think you're much more likely to see this card consistently with the sort of cards that say you're going to have to run back that are more flexible on more board states. So yeah, if you're playing Jinteki Glacier, if you border control them and they have to run the remote server again because the agendas are in the remote server, they're going to have to get Cloud Eater the second time. No different than the other Jinteki Glacier stuff you're expecting, Nisei Mark II, fantastic, and Biovault as well. So you only have one turn to get Cloud Eater value, and mind you, after that, it's still really good. It's still a big old sentry that's expensive to break, but if you want that Cloud Eater text to be relevant, reintroduce them, force them to run back, end the run, do all that Glacier stuff that you want, because you're going to get a lot for your money. Notably too, this is worth shouting out, Thunderbolt Armaments, the upcoming HB identity, cares about specifically AP or Destroyer Ice, and while this is both, there's no added benefit to that. You're definitely going to be seeing a Cloud Eater 2 out of faction. I think also for 3 influence for a unique card, it feels like you get your money's worth because you can play a full playset as much as you can put 3 in your deck. Putting 1 into your HB deck and getting it on certain turns seems really quite okay. So we'll get back to this point, but I do think that Cloud Eater is going to be spreading its large 7.5 meter length further than you think it might. Now that is the interesting part of the ice where it does something quite unique, something very specifically Cloud Eater that you're paying 10 credits for. But at the end of the day too, when it comes to any sort of like kind of crunchy analysis of ice, we largely have 3 talking points we want to address to talk about how good a piece of ice is. First thing, of course, we have to mention is the cost. Is this an ice that you can afford in your deck? And for a 10 cost ice, this is now the most expensive ice in the entire standard format, tied with a couple other friends. So we'll get to that because that is obviously a big problem with this card. Is massively expensive for a massively big snake. The next problem is, what does this card do to the game of Netrunner? Firstly, how bad is face checking into this ice? And then the existence of this ice, the existence of any ice, can have a huge impact on how runners as a whole interact with multiple board states. There's a really bad code gate that if you face check into it without a breaker is going to cost you a really big part of the game that'll fundamentally change how a runner plays into that matchup until they get the decoder down. So understanding what this card can do on average to many board states is super important. And then of course, how bad these subroutines are when they fire. And they're really quite bad, of course. The last point is a bit less sexy, and that comes down to kind of a mathematical thing. Because at the end of the day, once ice is rezzed, it's going to largely come down to a calculation that you paid X for it, and then over the game, the runner has to break this so many times, they pay Y every time. Certain cards are better on that axis based off of how much they cost to res, how much they cost to break, on what killers you expect or what icebreakers you expect to see on most tables. So those are the main 3 things: cost, what it does to the game, what it costs to break. Now let's start with cost, because 10 credits is obviously very notably expensive, and very notably expensive because it is the most expensive ice in the entire standard format. Well, we've been in standard formats that have more expensive ice than 10. Right now, things cap off at 10. There's a couple other ice. And mind you, Hydra and Teia see somewhat consistent play in certain decks. So technically 10 is doable as much as you kind of have to build your deck around it. I think what's quite notable though is while Teia shows up somewhat unfrequently, right now as a faction, Jinteki actually doesn't have a lot of good ways to interact with expensive ice the way that other factions can. And I think I'm going to specifically highlight HB here, because while Teia, it costs a lot, it's a really good piece of ice, there's a lot of ways in faction to get on the table cheaper or for free. There's Architect Deployment Test. There's other agendas that allow you to search your deck for a bespoke piece of ice and install it for free. You have things like Architects of Tomorrow that let you res that tier for 4 credits less, of course. We've seen Vovo around, divert power, some weird tricks to get this thing on the table. And in short, there's a lot of ways to cheat out the cost of ice. However, in Jinteki, if I'm not missing anything, there's no good way to make a 10 cost ice more palatable than just having more money. What's also really noteworthy is we've seen a lot of Jinteki like Glacier decks that are running some of the most expensive ice, and they go out of the way to cheap res the ice by scoring something out like a send a message. And what's really strange about this card is while send a messaging a Cloud Eater for free is still pretty good, a lot of the value attached to Cloud Eater is the fact that you can have the runner run into it on the turn that it is rezzed. And that's a really tricky thing about Cloud Eater, is that there's some board states where rezzing a Cloud Eater for free is the right play. There's other board states where you want to keep it as a surprise because the sneaky snake on 10 credits is going to do something bad on the turn. So cheating this out on your turn, not always the right thing to do. And it's going to be a really interesting decision. Now, mind you, even when it comes to HB, where cheating out the Cloud Eater with an Architect Deployment Test, it still eats that when rezzed on turn trigger, which is not what you want. But interestingly enough, we've seen one recent HB agenda called the Lightning Laboratory, which allows you to res something mid-run for free. And this is the sort of support that I think you're really excited to have with Cloud Eater, but right now it seems like it's all in HB. And I do think you're going to see a Cloud Eater in the HB deck in the near future, but just watch out, because in terms of resing this in Jinteki, it's kind of tricky. At the end of the day, all it comes down to is just having good enough money. I'd say right now, Jinteki economy isn't the best it's ever been. It's still doable. Holiday Review is a nice spot. A 5 credit operation means that you're threatening 10 credits as soon as turn 1, as much as resing this on turn 1 is not a great idea. You can get enough money in your deck to res some very expensive ice. This deck, mind you, is from a meta of old, and it is a deck that's running some of the most expensive Jinteki ice of all time. In fact, there's even 2 tiers in this deck. And largely this makes sense, and we'll come back to this. One of the best IDs I think you can play Cloud Eater in is Ag Infusion. And Ag Infusion gives you this ability to redirect runners into the outermost ice rezzed on any server. So the idea is that if, as long as you res one Cloud Eater somewhere and get that up, you can trash an unresed ice to introduce them to that Cloud Eater. And you actually end up saving money because as a whole, you have to end up spending less money on more ice and instead put all your money on a single ice and then just have that as a constant threat whenever the runner runs. But again, this deck has a lot of really expensive ice and you see it has to just slow down and spend a lot of time working on money. And it's just not the easiest thing to put a Cloud Eater into like any mid-range Jinteki deck. I think you're actually going to have to plan around it a bit because 10 credits is a lot as much as you might just run one copy of it. So maybe you sneak through. I think you have to worry that this is a very expensive ice. So it's potentially doable as much as I think you're going to have to plan around it. And it's not going to exactly go everywhere. Now, the next thing, let's talk about how bad these subroutines are and how bad the face check is and our runner's going to play around this. And the face check on this is really quite brutal. It's very, very bad. I would say it's potentially game losing on certain board states. But I think the big thing so it shouldn't catch runners unawares is that we already in the standard format have kind of a facsimile in which runners already understand they have to respect. Mind you, Anansi used to be a bit more of a Jinteki staple maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. We're not seeing that much of it. But the idea is that if you do not have a killer, you don't have a way to break sentries, and the corporation has at least 8 credits, and mind you, it's now technically 10 credits for Cloud Eater, the face check can be quite bad. Anansi, mind you, I'd argue doesn't have as bad as a face check as long as you're not dying to its text, in which it can threaten to do technically 4 to 3 net damage as long as you can pay for a card draw, you won't flatline. But while Anansi's really good for the corporation, Cloud Eater's really bad for the runner. So at least runners are already kind of comfortable with the idea that if the corporation has a lot of money and you don't have a sentry breaker and enough money to potentially break an Anansi, and Cloud Eater is a fair bit more expensive to break than Anansi, you shouldn't be face checking wantonly. So it's not going to be like we suddenly introduced a deadly code gate into Wayland. It's going to be similar to something you were respecting before. So it's going to change how people respect certain board states, but not that different because you get blown out by Anansi, you get even more blown out by Cloud Eater. It's not that big of a difference. It's a slight difference. I do think there are some board states where tanking an Anansi is right. I think there's going to be way fewer board states where tanking a Cloud Eater is correct in the early game. Do keep that in mind as much as there only might be one Cloud Eater in the deck. So good luck finding it or not finding it. Now, one at a time, the subroutines, trash one installed runner card, that is a brutal subroutine. That's actually one of the best subroutines you can have on any Netrunner card of all time, because very importantly, Cloud Eater is a corporation's card. So when the corporation fires that subroutine, they choose which card they trash. They can trash anything. Trashing breakers is really important. This is kind of on a faction base. Criminals specifically are running lots of times only one of each of their breakers. So if you trash their fractor, good luck dealing with the tattoo bolas for the rest of the game. It might not be impossible because criminals have other tricks, AIs, boomerangs, inside jobs, but it's going to be really important and very important when it comes to how you play around Jinteki specifically, is if you're playing against a matchup where you expect to take some amount of errant damage to either subroutines or traps or agendas, something like that. A lot of times you'll take the cards that are important from your hand and put them on the table before you lose them to damage. Which means if you're putting your Kurapira down sooner than you would in most matchups, it's now a target for Cloud Eater. And if it's your only Kurapira, it's a problem. So being able to trash programs can be a huge problem against certain matchups. And I think that's one of the scariest face checks for criminal, that you have to respect this, because losing the wrong program at the wrong time can just cost you the game. It's still kind of bad against Shapers and Anarchs, but they have a bit more recursion built in, a bit more redundancy, but obviously it can be really, really bad and still very important. Mind you, this is any card, it's not just a program too. So taking down hardware, a console, for instance, to stop an entire engine, let alone have an MU problem suddenly, that'd be quite bad as well. So this can really hit bad on basically any front. That's just a really good subroutine. It's just up to the corporation to target which card is the worst for you to lose, and hopefully they'll find it. And worst is generally pretty bad. Now, the second subroutine is really interesting because it says give the runner 2 tags. This is now the 5th card in the Jinteki card pool that cares about tags, so the number is growing for sure. But it is a subroutine that inherently, when it comes to Jinteki, is going to be kind of tricky because the way that we see it right now, we don't actually have a lot of ways to capitalize on tags in Jinteki. We talked about mindscaping, and I think you might see mindscaping in the sort of slow mid-range decks that are playing, Glacier, Cloud Eater type stuff. And while mindscaping on 2 decks does 2 net damage, that can be annoying. It's hard for that to be lethal. And are you holding on to your mindscaping so they tank to your Cloud Eater? Probably not. So I think the value of this is going to come down to whether there's Jinteki tag punishments and whether that matters how soon you have to clear the tags. And mind you, just clearing the tags is honestly annoying enough. And a lot of runners will want to clear the tags because, of course, they have resources. And very specifically, if you're playing Jinteki Glacier, a lot of your resources get a lot of value because you can't make a lot of runs. So a lot of runners have to slow down and get their economy, get their value from some of their long-going resources, let alone slow building up multi-axis. Because if you can't run a lot against Ag Infusion, these sort of cards are really important. So trashing them is really important. So those tags are really important. Notably too, this subroutine means that the runner loses 4 credits and 2 clicks. That's a massive subroutine and comparable to other sort of stuff. Like if you look at the non-threat Atini that just says the runner loses 2 credits, would you rather lose 2 credits or 2 credits and a click? There's a lot of times the tag is actually worse, dependent on when you take it in the turn and whether you want to clear it or not. That's obviously going to change it. So we'll see how scary the tags are. I imagine it could be quite frightening. That's a rude subroutine. That's a lot of tempo loss. Notably too, because we've seen the upcoming anarchist Sebastio, and Sebastio's text specifically cares about removing tags and not having tags. Sebastio's power fires when you take a tag when you didn't have any tags. And then we're seeing events that only fire if you are not tagged. And I think we're going to see a lot of players on early JNet trying to mash their privileged access when they're buried by a couple tags. And you just basically slow down the Sebastio deck a fair bit. As much as Sebastio probably is going to have on-tempo ways to clear tags, it might be pretty interesting. Tags can quite matter. The final subroutine is do 3 net damage, which is obviously quite scary, but that one is in some ways less impactful. On the basis that you're expecting, if you're running into a massive sentry, if you're expecting the corporation to have a lot of money and you don't have a breaker, there's a lot of ways that you can take more net damage on a single card. So it is a good subroutine, that's for sure, because you definitely want to break it. It's not a great hit for you. But at the end of the day, if you're surprised that a massive Jinteki ice does damage to you and you're not prepared for that, you probably shouldn't be running in the first place. So obviously very good, but it's just kind of expected. And I think it leads us to the most interesting question is that on the encounter that you run into this thing, which subroutine do you choose to enact upon yourself? And I'd argue that first subroutine trash one installed runner card, unless it's like the last run of the game, you can't do that one. That one's way too good. Allowing the corporation to destroy the best part of your board is not an option you want to give the corporation. So is it 3 net damage? It might be. I think if you're playing Anarch and you have a lot of like trash from hand synergy, why not? But you obviously have to be careful because other ice, let alone traps and agendas, can care about how many cards you have in your hand, and it's still a tempo hit. So I think abstractly, a lot of the times, the subroutine that you're going to choose to cloud eat on top of yourself is to give the runner 2 tags, which means that you're running through this ice, probably breaking it, and we'll talk about that in a second because it's really expensive, and then still having to clear 2 tags on the turn that it's rezzed, heaven forbid being, border controlled, and you have to consider running it again. That's wild. It's a Jinteki card that just oppos you. It just oppos you. If this runs and you don't have a breaker, it double oppos you probably because you can't take 6 net damage. You probably don't want to trash 2 cards. I think that's fascinating. It's a real hard thought experiment to think of on which board state, which of these subroutines is worse for you. And it's probably the tag one. And then it comes down to whether Jinteki has tag punishment for that to matter, or whether you just say, okay, I'm tag me now. I'm having 4 tags. I don't care. And then you're going to save money going through this for the rest of the game or the rest of that turn at a minimum. On that note too, I do think you can see this out of faction. I don't know if there's a huge reason to play it in something like Reality Plus, which can res it for 8 credits if the tag fires. Now in faction, we have Hydra, and Hydra's seeing some amount of play. As long as you can afford the Hydra, it's kind of resed for 3 credits in Reality Plus, which is pretty messed up. So they're comparable cards, but I could see a place where if you just want to play as many taxing sentries, because say sentry breakers are not very good in the meta, and you can identify that as a weak spot, this is a very reasonable card to play in just about any deck. The tags mattering, that is something certain factions can do better than others. Net damage is almost always good enough. That one's sometimes hard to capitalize on, but Trash One Installed Runner card is just a messed up subroutine that just about every deck can capitalize on. And for 3 influence, if you want to play a big card, this is more splashable than Anansi, that's for sure. Now, last point, let's talk about breaking, and the breaking math on this is brutal, as it should be for a 10-cost dice. So on the Shaper side, the most common killer we see right now is Echelon. Echelon's pretty rough, comes at a 1 strength. Only once you have 4 programs down are you breaking the Cloud Eater for 6 credits. Still not bad, but not the worst, but that's going to be a real late game before that happens. Again, Cloud Eater's unique as maybe a 1-of in the deck, so maybe it only shows up in the mid to late game, so maybe you're okay there. If you want to get a Turbine down, which of course you do, you still need 4 programs before you're breaking this thing for 3 credits. Mind you, breaking it for 3 credits is pretty messed up, and hopefully the on-res turn text matters, but yeah, obviously Turbine gets through it relatively well. Switching to Criminal, Carmen was really good at breaking Anansi. Again, Anansi is not that popular right now, but you broke Anansi for 5 with Carmen. Because we're at 6 strength on the Cloud Eater, you have to boost twice, so you break this for 7. That's a lot of money. That's nearly what you paid to res it, which is not too bad. If they have to break it twice for 14, you're doing really well. Now, I do think Revolver is going to see a bit more play in the upcoming meta on the basis that we have a really scary HB to face check into, potentially. And Revolver gets through for 4 credits and half the chambers, which is not too bad. That's kind of reasonable as like a panic button, so you can just start face checking. Or, of course, you can play Flip Switch and some of the other options we have access to. We'll be looking at a couple of them. Criminal tricks too, if you want to boomerang through this thing, the question is which subroutine do you allow fire? You're not going to get Anansi punished besides the turn that's rezzed. And I think largely based on board state, you can't let that first subroutine fire. So it's up to you to figure out which the middle or the last one is the one you're not going to boomerang. And quite quite frightening. 3 subroutines is a good spot to be on big ice. When it comes to Anarchs, the killer that you largely will deal with this, I think, is Noom, and breaking it for 6 with Noom isn't awful, but it's also not amazing, as much as Noom is a bit expensive. If you want to go through with Audrey, it's going to be 2 virus counters, 2 cards, so that is something, but that's technically one of the easiest ways to break this. Of course it is, Audrey's great. And then if you want to botulus through it, same sort of issue that you're going to run into, that you're probably only going to break 2 of the subroutines. I do think it's a good target for botulus for sure, but choosing which one's the worst for you, you probably take the net damage as Anarch, probably. And finally, quite notably, and we do see this in some of the Glacier matchups, some of the virus decks are running things like Tranquilizer. And this is one of the first few ice that's like not the weakest in some way to derez, because if you're allowed to re-res it, it's going to be bad as much as you're probably spending 20 credits, which is probably also unaffordable. I do think also you're going to see a bit more things like Laser Pointer. Let's see what the Mercury support looks like. And this is a really nice way to face check into this thing, as much as, again, Capybara derezzing is probably fine because it costs 10, but if it gets re-rezzed, you're going to have problems in the near future as well. Notably, Hush. I think Hush is always worth looking at, because I would be really surprised if NSG releases a single piece of ice in the set that doesn't have some sort of Hush utility. Now, hushing the text on this thing on the turn that it's rezzed is pretty important. You actually save a lot of subroutines, you save a lot of damage to yourself, so that's good. But it's a different space than Anansi, because you actually do see a lot of Anarchs in some weird board states hushing an Anansi and then just running through it. Because while the subroutines are good, they're generally not as good as breaking this thing for a lot of money. And specifically, a lot of the power of Anansi is offloaded to that top bar of text. And if you blank that, well, ice is okay. It's not bad, but it's not worth breaking. And this card's definitely not the same case. You probably still have to break this thing anyways because it's disgusting. And if you don't break it, the Hush can just be trashed by the first subroutine and the thing's going to do its thing anyways. So I think you still need to figure out how to break it. That being said, on the one turn where it's really popping off, Hush is not bad. That's for sure. But Hush is usually not bad. Overall, it's hard to break. And like for 10 credits, you'd hope it is. It doesn't exactly have a Nancy text to dunk on anything that's trying to cheat around it, but it's really good on the temporal nature of the turn that's rezzed. It is quite mean. And then after that, right, if you pay 10 credits for a card that now just is a wall of subroutines and strength, it seems relatively reasonable. So maybe you can just get this up with a send a message. Maybe it's not the worst, as much as you love the text to be relevant. Finally, what decks can we play this in? We talked about Ag Infusion. It's really good in Ag Infusion because, again, you save money on it, you redirect into it. You can play 2 copies, and then your second copy you choose not to res because it trashes the first one. You just trash that as a face down card. So you have a lot of value there too, and then you can force the runner into it multiple times if you put it on your scoring remote. We also didn't talk about that. I think you generally put the sites on the scoring remote. I don't think you want to put that much money on a central server, especially if you're trying to score out agendas on a remote server. Just generally it's going to go on a remote server, and that remote server is going to be nearly impossible to run. Other fun stuff, if you want to drag Konjin. If you win the side game on Konjin and it's the turn it's res, that's going to be a lot to line up, but you can do some really mean stuff and just get more value from resing one big ice. And then of course, if you're on the runner side, hippo this thing, destroy it. You want to break it once. You don't want to break it more than once. It's always a shame when your stuff gets hippoed. That's an Ag Infusion problem, but if you're worried about hippo in standard, just don't put this at your outermost. Just put something in front of it. And that's it. It's a massive snake and such an interesting design. I do want to shout out that I'm not honestly the biggest fan of some of the bigger ice in Netrunner. I don't think having massive ice makes the game inherently more interesting, because a lot of times it just shuts off servers and then you make less decisions. And it's cool. I think it's nice that there's an archetype of higher end stuff being supported. But I think my favorite thing about Cloud Eater by a mile is that it is unique. And so it's harder to get into a world in which you can just put the biggest ice on every server and lock the runner out. You have to make some decisions of where the big thing goes. Again, we've said this before, but it being unique is really tricky because understanding where it's going to go and where its placement and how many of them are in the deck and where it is slithering around the Amazon just to connect with your face on a bad turn, that's all going to be really tricky. And there's going to be some big blowouts to this because do you play around a unique one of card? Maybe. But it's really exciting and a cool design for a big old Sentry, and largely I'm imagining going to be the new Anansi once we hit FFG rotation in the near future. Until then, enjoy your giant snake, play some HP, res it for free a couple times. You're going to have a good time, that's for sure. All right, now our final Jinteki card today. This is the unique, very interesting asset, Charlotte Caçador. Cost 0, again, unique, clone asset. Text says you can advance this asset. Says when your turn begins, you may remove 1 hosted advancement counter to gain 4 credits and draw 1 card. At instant speed during any paid ability window, you can also trash Charlotte as long as she has at least 1 advancement counter to gain 3 credits. 2 influence, 2 trash costs. The flavor text is a quote saying they offered me a desk job, but damn it, I just love working in the field. Now, I think this is such an adorable spoiler card to get on this channel because very specifically, Charlotte kind of had a home here on the Metropol grid. And that's because the first time we were introduced to Charlotte is through the short piece An Eye for Talent, written by friend of Metroball Grid and my personal old friend, Patrick Sklar, who wrote this short story introducing ourselves to Charlotte, working alongside Adrian Sayce to kind of dress up as medical professionals and kidnap some clones. Read the story, it's really quite good, and if you don't want to read it yourself, Patrick actually was kind enough to join on our once per month stream together and do a live reading of the piece itself and talk a bit about the process. Now, when it comes to the flavor text, Patrick basically said this flavor text live on stream when he was describing the character as one of the best, most senior Teia clone catching clones, and while Teia wants to protect her and keep her at base because she's so valuable, she constantly is out there in the field getting her hands dirty, and she just really likes working. Now, speaking of that, when it comes to the name, mind you, you can translate Caçador in Portuguese Brazilian, and Caçador means hunter. Subtle. Very specifically, though, the art I had such a fun time with. Mind you, we did an animation of this art. Marlon Ruiz did fantastic job with this art for sure, and there's some really cool references if you piece it together. Of course, Charlotte, mind you, works for Teia, and Teia is there capturing clones, so that's what they do as much as they employ clones themselves. And specifically, the lady at the bar is an Ayase clone, one of the clone lines we're seeing a lot in the Liberation cycle. And while Iro Ayase is depicted in a sort of like lavender business getup, we have an Ayase clone in a kind of similar but more of a clubbing style, where it's the same sort of color, but now we're looking at leather and studs, and the hair is slightly different, but also the same. The sort of angle of clones with personality is absolutely fantastic, but this is definitely an Ayase that something bad is going to be happening to quite soon. Now, another fantastic reference on Marlon's art, and I don't know whether this was in the art brief or not, or if Marlon's just plugged in. The bartender at the bar that's pouring a drink is wearing a t-shirt for a band, and that band is called Debbie and the Downtowners. And you actually see a picture of Debbie holding, you can't tell if it's exactly a bass guitar or a guitar, but just such a fantastic reference. Some fun world building there for sure. Now, this card is so interesting because it's modal and it gives a lot of options, and it's kind of exactly what I wanted in Jinteki. It's a mixture of some sort of bluff and misdirection, but fundamentally can be quite a workhorse of a flexible economy card that can support multiple archetypes. This is what I want to see in Jinteki right now, that I feel like it's lacking a bit of these like kind of baseline, just utility econ cards. And this card is absurd in some ways because it's a combination of some of the strongest Netrunner cards of all time, even some of the most defining cards in the standard format, as much as it has a different take on them. And I would say that this is a combination of two big cards, two big neutral cards that, again, are standard defining. NGO Front, the sort of advanceable trap that if the runner runs it at even at instant speed, it's gone. Oops, I got money. Trick's on you. And then, of course, Rashida Yahim, which is the best card to put in a remote server that's not an agenda. She survives a turn and gives you 3 cards and 3 credits, which basically gives you 1.5 free Netrunner turns to accelerate and go do good Netrunner. That's wild. And obviously, while I think Charlotte's a bit more tricky, she also reminds us of some other very interesting and weird cards, which kind of muddies the conversation a bit. There's a bit of API S-Keeper Isabel, where you're trading an advancement for more than 3 credits, mind you, if it survives a turn. And then even one of the most powerful Netrunner cards of all time, Estelle Moon. This card was banned for a long time. It's not in the standard format, but she got continual value. And it was just a card that you could not leave on the table. And even on the turn that you ran Estelle, Estelle ran away and got value, which is not that dissimilar to Charlotte, which is a card that you cannot leave on the table because the longer you leave it, the worse it is. And even if you do challenge it, she's going to disappear and get value for the corporation, which is a really cool look. Now let's begin with the first line here that says, at the start of your turn, while she's rezzed, you can remove an advancement counter from her to gain 4 credits and get a card draw. That's a very powerful start of turn effect, as much as you have to spend time and money advancing this. So say that you get Charlotte in a remote server and you spend a click to advance it and Charlotte survives a turn, you basically spent a click and a credit to get a card draw and 4 credits on the following turn. Now, it's actually kind of a bit of a messy trade because that credit and click you spent advancing the card, you could have just drawn a card and saved a credit. So the value you get from Charlotte is not as much as it might seem, but it definitely is really good when it fires. At least it feels really good. Notably too, drawing a card in the middle of your turn, let alone the end of your turn versus at the start of your turn is worth something different. But it's more like you're pushing your value down chain and it's saying, I'm going to spend a little now to get obviously a bit more later. And in some ways, it kind of feels comparable to if you run archives, say turn 1 with Hoshiko, just to access a card in archives, it's face up, you know what it is, but you get that flip. So you do something that's better than the base action of drawing a card or clicking for credit. You get both for the single click, as much as that action right now is not really great on tempo. Now, it's obvious here that when you put this thing on the table, you actually do need to ice it up, which is not dissimilar to Rashida. It's a bit dissimilar to how NGO Front works, and we'll get to that in a bit. but it's really important that you get this behind ice as soon as possible, because unlike Rashida that you just put on the table, you have to actually spend more time and more money on it, so you're putting a bit more of your eggs in the same basket. 4 credits on a card draw is a lot, and I'd argue that this card is actually less similar to Rashida in some ways and a bit more similar to, say, something like a daily quest. A card that you have to protect at all costs, but as long as it's there, it is a pretty strong economic backbone. It's also really similar in some ways to Wall, and mind you, Wall and Daily Quest are maybe easier to play because this card you have to continually advance over and over again. It is a really solid in-faction economy card as much as it might be a bit click intensive. I really wanted something like Sundew going into the set, something to put in the remote server that it gives you good value on turns that you don't have an agenda, that in-faction can give you some economy. And as much as advancing once per turn can be expensive, getting 4 credits and a card draw every turn is kind of exactly what you want to push yourself forward. Again, that advancement, we can't undersell it. That advancement is clumsy because it makes every turn you have to spend at least 1 click every turn. And as soon as you advance an economy card, you're spending money to make money later, and it obviously detracts. You get less money overall. We've seen this a bit before with Ubiquitous Vig, which is a card that can give you ludicrous money, but every time you physically advance it yourself, you are losing money, so it is longer for the Vig to pay off, and that's obviously a problem with Vig. But that's maybe okay here, because we're playing Jinteki, and we have some pretty strong things that we want to play anyways in our mid-range score-out deck that can give us those free advancements. Lacosta Grid is absolutely fantastic, and as long as you trigger your start of turn things in the right order, you're getting a free Charlotte every turn, just free advancements, literally 4 credits on a card draw. Obviously, you could be advancing anything else in the server. Sometimes they're more important cards, but that is the start of basis where you can make this really work for you, as opposed to being a bit of a daily quest, but with a bit more effort, but you do get card draw. It's not bad. Also, shoutouts too. We've seen some really strange cards in the last kind of reveals of like Wayland cards that cheaply advance 2 other cards, 2 different cards, mind you. And this sort of stuff, I don't know if I'm definitely going to be jamming into the sort of decks, but you get some interesting conclusions to work with, that's for sure. Another thing that's really notable about this card is that it's really nice in a Teia in some ways, mostly because the Teia wants to be doing a double install, so having something that draws cards is actually quite relevant. That's not a lot of Jinteki cards that draws cards, so having a full hand means you can do some good Teia stuff. And it's also maybe a card that it gets a bit cheaper to play when you install it clicklessly when you're doing your thing anyways to build the Teia servers. Again, what server does it go into? Are you icing this server? I think you have to, but I think it works really well in a Teia where you get click compression, and just putting things in servers to keep the runner busy is a nice way to go. Now we have our weird Jinteki version of Wall, their daily quest. There's another really cool part of this card, which is NGO Front. And the NGO Front has the same sort of idea where it looks like an agenda, and if the runner calls it and they make a successful run, you can still trash it to get your money. But this card's very different from NGO Front because it pays out way less, even on as little as 1 advancement counter, as much as it does have other utility. I think that's actually quite interesting in some ways because it makes this card, you have to consider it a bit more of where you put it. And there's still some big blowouts, and you can still use this as an install advance. It looks like a 5/3 agenda. What is it? As much as I think you have to be a bit careful when you play it. NGO Front, we see sometimes more often than not as just an economy card the corp spends their whole turn on. Again, you have an uniced remote server, you just install NGO Front naked, you do advance. And sometimes the runner does have to run it because they're worried that you're going to put out a cheeky 5/3 agenda or 4/2 agenda on the table because of course it's an NGO Front. Why would I run it? So while you do end up getting 8 credits, you did spend your whole turn on it, so it's closer to 6 to 5 credits. It's not bad, but NGO Front has proven to be a good enough economy card in most board states that you don't actually have to do anything too tricksy with it. Now, the best time to use NGO Front is actually, again, behind ice, because if the runner runs through ice, spends money to break stuff, and in the last minute, the reveal is that it's not an agenda, that's when NGO Front ascends from a reasonable economy card to such a huge tempo swing. So that being said, the way that Charlotte works, where you only trash for 3 credits, makes that sort of just brute force NGO play way less interesting. And I think you're gonna have to consider way more often to use this as a card that looks like something in a remote server, and if the runner runs, you still just disappear with your money. That's going to be interesting. It's also really cool too, because it's a card that just has utility. Imagine that Charlotte only had the top bar of text, but she also has the bottom part. So even at the end of the day, if the runner does contest this, and they probably have to contest this if you're advancing this every turn, you're still just going to get 3 credits and they still have to run through your eyes. Mind you, also on 2 credits, you could consider letting the runner trash it. 2 credits is much better than 1 credit, and sometimes that can matter. But at the end of the day, you just still have NGO text on a card that arguably maybe didn't exactly need it, but you're definitely going to appreciate it. I think something that's really interesting also about the existence of Charlotte, and I think Charlotte is largely widely enough playable in Jinteki, is the same way that NGO Front gave a lot of corporations the ability to bluff agendas. Once NGO Front existed, a lot of corporations had access to a card that they wanted to play that makes it unobvious whether the card they advanced in the remote server was an agenda or not. Mind you, a lot of advanceable traps did not see play before NGO Front, barring certain archetypes where you could kind of see them coming. So generally when a corporation did install advance in a remote server, you knew it was an agenda because there's nothing else in their deck they would do that to. And the existence of NGO Front opened up that space where now it's a 50-50 whether it's an NGO Front and you've spent a lot of money just to get nothing or whether it's the real agenda. And while that's a really cool part about NGO Front, Charlotte obviously sort of does that. If I do install advanced in the remote server, the runner has to figure out, oh, damn, is that a Charlotte or is that just an off-world office or a Nisei Mark II? And I think that's really cool, especially for Jinteki, a faction that largely wants to do some amount of bluffing. That's a nice tool to have on top of the NGO Front so you can play for at least the rest of the year until FFG stuff rotates. Mind you, to influence as well, you can see her out of faction, and there's certain factions that have a lot of good utility with Charlotte. Pravdivos, mind you, if the runner makes a run and there's a Charlotte on the table, that's not an advancement counter, that's 4 cards in a card draw. That's a lot of value and makes Ubiquitous Vig look a bit silly, that's for sure. We've also seen business as usual, mind you, we're just seeing weird Pravdivos support to advance multiple cards, so it's easier to get just good enough value while doing other board state stuff. This card's only 1 influence. And of course, built to last. One of the biggest things with Built to Last to make sure that your ID is relevant on more turns is having a card that you want to advance once and then removes the counter. And it's just kind of wild if you get Charlotte in a remote server and you're getting 6 credits in a card draw every turn. It's comparable to wall, that's for sure. And if you can spend the influence, maybe it's worth it, maybe it's not. But at the end of the day, that's a very powerful amount of economy you can get turn after turn after turn. Unfortunately, also a bummer, Saraswati Mnemonics, it's the one card in Jinteki that advances stuff on tempo, and unfortunately the fact that you can't res this until your next start of turn means you miss the window, so Charlotte has to hang out for 2 turns. Color me unexcited. You also can just play this in trap decks, mind you, right? Like NGO Front shows up in the sort of mitosis trap decks on the basis that those decks don't have a lot of money, and mitosising out an NGO Front feels pretty good. And now you have another card as well. You have another option as a financial option that can give you card draw. And I think this is my favorite point about this card, because I think trying to analyze this card, how it's going to play out on certain board states is actually relatively tricky. And I think this is a good example of saying why that is. Say you're playing a trap deck and you mitosis out a Charlotte. Charlotte is now on the table with 2 advancements. Say the runner does not specifically run it on the basis that they think it's a trap or they don't want to do it. At the start of your turn, you res Charlotte, you remove an advancement counter, you've got 4 credits and a card draw. And now Charlotte is still on the table with an advancement on her. Now the runner has a really obnoxious decision to make. They can spend a click running Charlotte, and if that's the case, obviously you trash Charlotte and you got 7 credits. So it's very close to an NGO Front. It's not 8 credits, it's 7 credits and a card draw. And I'd argue having card draw to keep your hand full in those sort of trap decks is actually relatively important. And what about if they don't run it? You're going to get another 4 credits and a card draw. So now Charlotte was 8 credits and 2 card draw. And then what happens? You advance it again, they have to consider running it. You spend 1 advancement admittedly to get only 2 credits in some, you spend a click for 2 credits, but they still always have to consider running this, because as long as Charlotte's on the table and you're threatening to advance it, it is a lot of value that they have to deal with. And I think that's so fascinating. A single Charlotte install double advance the same way that you would do for an NGO Front. If the runner does not immediately run it, in which case you get 3 credits, not amazing, but not the worst, it's at a minimum 7 credits and a card draw. So it's this weird space between Rashida, Daily Quest, Wall to Wall, and NGO Front that is very flexible. And I think there's a lot of Jinteki decks that just like a card like that. That's kind of trapsy, but more is just reasonably good economy. And I know we've said this before, but if you can compare this with any way to get the cheap advancements to make this a bit more of a kind of efficiency card, there's a really high ceiling here. Again, Lacosta Grid is just really good value to set up in a remote server. And even if the runner challenges it, mind you, only if it has an advancement on it, she's disappearing anyways, and you're getting your money worth. There's a lot of other really good things. Again, if you want to play more grids and a Teia too, just to install stuff, get more value tempo, that's great. It's a card that the runner has to consider dealing with, so why not get some more value? And I probably have said this before, but just getting card draw is really rare in Jinteki. Most Jinteki cards that give you actual card draw are attached to ice subroutines and strange agendas, but having card draw is really important for a Teia. So every turn getting 4 credits in a card draw, as much as you're hopefully not paying an advancement on it, that can be pretty wild. There's even other decks, as much as most of these are regions, so you have to decide where to go. But in Jinja, putting this in remote server advancing it every time means you're getting 2 mandatory card draw, largely, while getting 4 credits, which is fantastic for your Jinja City gridded Teia deck. It's really flexible. Having cards in hand is super important for something like Anoetic Void to end the run, to Hansei Review to throw out the worst card, or the card you're going to discard anyways, or just to show the worst set of options with Celebrity Gift. This thing is cool. It's clumsy. I think advancing this every turn is going to be a real cost. And unless you can set up a board state where it's hard to challenge or you're getting the advancements for free, that is definitely a real cost. But making plays where you do install advance, again, if the runner does run it and break 3 rice, you're going to get some amount of value. It's not NGO front, but if they don't run it, they have to consider running it later, and you're just going to get pretty good value. 7 credits in a card draw at a minimum if they don't challenge it is not bad whatsoever. This is a very cool card and something that's really making me excited to play a bit more at Teia and get stuff in remote servers, because this one does seem really, really quite fun across a lot of Jinteki stuff. Shout out to Charlotte again. Check out Patrick's story. I'm a big fan of it, and seeing this character in art, absolutely fantastic. On that note, that's the end of the Jinteki spoilers we have here. We have 3 cards, and mind you, if you're watching this, we're basically halfway through the community spoilers season. There's a lot going on right now. You've probably seen some other stuff, and there's more stuff this week. If you go to Null Signal Games, there's an entire calendar of things to see. We're only on Wednesday, so do make sure that you're checking in on this, seeing other content creators, people on the internet, podcasts, stuff like that, and giving them some love and checking out their spoilers, because a lot of effort goes into spoilers week, and people are pretty happy to show off some really cool stuff. So far, again, the sets look really exciting. I think the Liberation cycle has been one of my favorite cycles to date, and these Jinteki cards are definitely going to make some pretty mean decks for sure, and I'm really excited to see these cards in paper in just a couple days. On that note, again, huge thank you to the Null Signal Games folks for supplying us with these cards that we can show off. And in the comments too, I would really like to hear what cards you're most excited about, which ones you think my analysis are really wrong about or really correct, and what sort of decks you're rushing out to build. Because again, there's also a big chance that these cards are going to look fundamentally different once 1 or 2 other cards, whether they are Jinteki or not, are revealed, and then they make even more sense or maybe even less sense. Who knows? But on that note, thanks for joining us for the spoiler seasons. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you get Rebellion Without Rehearsal in your hands real soon. Take care. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that. We have some really exciting cards to talk about. Again, Rebellion Without Rehearsal, it's only out in 5 days, and once the set drops on the 18th, we're going to be streaming a lot that week, more than our regular Tuesday to Thursday stream schedule. That'll be coming up again on the 18th. A bit dependent on how quickly things are up on Jinteki.net. Huge shout out to the JNet devs, they do a fantastic job. But we'll be in probably every day that week, if not every weekday. So tune in if you want to see some very soon Rebellion Without Rehearsal hit the tables. Again, I can only do this sort of stuff because of the support of patrons. We're supported on Patreon. The Metroball Grid is incredibly grateful. These are, mind you, just the Sure Gamble and Degree Mail patrons. We have Daily Cast patrons as well. And I want to give a huge thank you to everyone here for helping support the Metroball Grid, because honestly, we could not put this sort of time into this sort of thing without this sort of financial support. So I'm absolutely grateful that we can be putting this much time in making Netrunner content. It is kind of a dream come true. So thank you so much. If you want to support the channel, you can find the link in the Patreon below. Any amount of contribution is incredibly appreciated, and if financially that doesn't make sense, you just want to like the video, share it, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot of ways to help support the Metroball Grid. On that note, thanks so much. Hopefully you're as hyped as I am. Enjoy the rest of community spoiler season. It's always an absolute treat, and we'll see you real soon, hopefully streaming. Oh, it's Rebellion Without Rehearsal in just a couple of days. Cheers.